Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. It is July 1st, Sunday, 2018. And tonight we are going to be talking about when the U.S. confiscated silver. But first, let's just take a look at what might have happened during the day. Not too much. Sunday, the news doesn't happen when there's no reporters around. It's like if a tree falls in the forest, and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, if things happen and there weren't journalists there to report it, did anything happen today? I didn't see much happen today. The cryptos were active today, and were basically flat. Bitcoin closed at $63.50. It didn't close. It's always trading. Litecoin at about $80. Ethereum about $4.50. And I think Bcash was in the 700s. And gold and silver are closed on the weekend. There's some trading that begins at about 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and both gold and silver are essentially flat. Silver at $16.09 and gold at $12.53. All right, so today's topic is when the U.S. confiscated silver. For most of you probably never heard of that. Everyone's heard of the story of President Roosevelt's Executive Order 6102 that required U.S. citizens to turn in their gold. And when they did that in May of 1933, the order required Americans to turn in their gold, including their gold coins and any bullion they may have. And that gold was exchanged by the U.S. government at the then market price or set price of $20.67. So they collected it all during 1933 from the time of the executive order. And then in 1934, the U.S. government, Congress, passed the Gold Act of 1934, and they revalued the price to $35. And between 1933 and 1934, Roosevelt and his Secretary of Treasury, Morgenthau, actually themselves set the price, ratcheting it higher from the $20.67 up to near $34 an ounce. We all know that happened, and that essentially drove the value of the dollar down, the price of gold higher, and the government made off with a nice profit because they bought the gold at $20.67 and then they revalued it at $35. And then they proceeded to build Fort Knox to house all of this gold. They built Fort Knox, I think it was completed in 1937, so this state-of-the-art at the time fort to house the gold took a couple of years to build, and that was during the Depression, so it was probably a nice make-work project to put the gold in. Now let's get to this silver confiscation. Executive Order 6814 that was issued by none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt required the turning in of silver bullion to the United States government. Now I'm going to give you the parameters of this silver confiscation. Silver, U.S. and foreign coins, however, were exempt. Now, this is different than the gold confiscation that happened in 1933. This is in 1934, where the President Roosevelt is asking Americans for their silver. But unlike the 1933 Gold Confiscation Act, where they took the gold coins, they did not take the silver, U.S. and foreign coins. And we're going to see why in a bit. But during this confiscation, it lasted from 1934 to 1938. 123 million ounces of silver were turned in to the U.S. Mint. Now, if you want to look up the order, I'm not making this up. Everyone knows about Executive Order 6102. From Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I think it was May 1st, 1933. This order was Executive Order 6814. The order was dated August 9th, 1933. 1934. And in 1934, when this was issued, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was requiring the delivery of all silver to the United States. It required all person to deliver the silver to the U.S. pursuant to, wasn't just an executive order, him acting on his own, the Silver Purchase Act of 1934. So Congress had passed the Silver Purchase Act of 1934, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt in August of 1934 required American citizens to turn in the gold other than their silver coins that were in circulation at the time, or if they had any foreign silver coins. Those were not required to be turned in. Now, what had to be turned in? It's pretty broad. The executive order required that silver situated in the United States, basically, if it was in the United States, it had to be turned in. What else? Silver of a fineness of 80% or more. And there was a de minimis exemption. If you had silver more than 500 troy ounces for any one person, you had to turn it in. So in today's world, if you've got a monster box, that's about all you can have. Anything after that, you had to turn in anything over 500 ounces. I believe a monster box is 25 rolls of 21 ounce American Silver Eagles. They didn't have monster boxes back then, but if you had over 500 ounces per person, you had to turn in the silver. Now, as I mentioned, the silver that was exempt were U.S. coins. And I remember at the time in 1934, you had dimes that were 90% silver. You had quarters, half dollars that were 90% silver. And you had at the time the silver dollars, the peace dollars in 1934. And they were all 90% silver. Also, you didn't have to turn in if you had Swiss francs that were made of silver, Canadian silver that was 80% silver. If you had British silver coins, you did not have to turn those in. Now, if the silver was less than 80% fine, you didn't have to turn that in either. Also, if you had silver that you had held in good faith for a specific and customary use, but not for bullion, for example, I guess silverware, jewelry, silver ornaments, they weren't in bullion investment, meaning you weren't hoarding your silver. You were using it for adornment or for silverware or something like that. Or if you had silver and you had an industrial need, you didn't have to turn it in either. If it was less than 500 troy ounces, and you could also have it for artistic purposes if you were crafting items out of silver. Why did the government want to take your silver? We know why they wanted to take the gold. They basically were messing with the monetary system, taking the gold coins out, and they were going to revalue the gold, and they were going to make sure that they got their inflation somehow by revaluing gold, and they basically confiscated it, and it became the property of the U.S. government. The reason the government, or Roosevelt and the government, through the Silver Purchase Act of 1934, confiscated the silver was for a different reason. Now, they paid fair market value at the time. It was a little bit more. It was about 50 cents an ounce after they did their calculation. They did manage to get 112, I'll give you the exact number, 112,937,925 ounces of silver pursuant to Executive Order 6814. And this went off without a peep. No one protested. 1935, they collected 112 million ounces. In 1936, they collected 650,000 ounces. In 1937, they collected 68,000 ounces. 1938, 17,000 some odd ounces. So almost 113 million ounces were acquired under the Silver Purchase Act. But the Silver Purchase Act did not just cover silver from American citizens. The Silver Purchase Act also authorized, and they purchased 1.353 billion ounces pursuant to the Silver Purchase Act. Now, what is going on here? 1934, why does the U.S. government need silver? Why are they asking its citizens, confiscating its silver, and then going around the world and buying, having Congress authorize the purchase of 1.35 billion ounces of silver? So basically, add that number to the amount that was nationalized from the citizens, and basically they got 10 times more from buying silver elsewhere than they did from its citizens. Now that silver was accumulated just like the nationalized silver from the citizens from 1935 to 1938. I started a bit towards the end of the year. The government had bought 420,000 ounces in 1934, but by 1935, the government had purchased, pursuant to the Silver Purchase Act of 1934, 293 million ounces of silver. The next year, they purchased, in 1936, 558 million ounces. Now, put that in perspective. 558 million ounces purchased in 1 year. In today's mining, that is more than 5/8 of the total silver mining production globally. Then in 1937, they bought another 163 million, and in 1938, they bought 337 million ounces of silver. So all in, the U.S. government bought about 1.5 billion ounces, either from its citizens that were required to turn it in, or that they went out and purchased in the open market. Now, why did the government need all this silver? It wasn't for the war. You would never need that much silver for the war, and the war wasn't even on the horizon at the time in 1934. They weren't planning for the advent of Hitler and the bombing of Pearl Harbor, although maybe Roosevelt was, but that's not why they were acquiring the silver. The reason the government needed it, well, I'm not going to tell you yet. I'm going to tell you what happened. In 1918, let's go back before 1934, when Franklin Roosevelt is asking its citizens, U.S. citizens, to turn in its silver, and Congress passed the Silver Purchase Act. You're wondering, why do they want all this silver? What do they need all this silver for? Well, in 1918, pursuant to the Pittman Act, the United States had melted down over 250 million, or 270 million ounces of, or 270 million U.S. silver dollars, and converted them into silver bullion and sold them to England. Now, what is going on? Why would the United States in 1918 take not all, but a good portion of those Morgan silver dollars, melt them down, and ship the silver to England? Well, England needed the silver to alleviate a silver coin shortage in India, which was a colony of England's at the time. So England had a coin shortage. And the United States thought they could help out England, but also make a little coin on the side by pulling the Morgan silver dollars out of circulation, melting them, marking up the price, and sending them to England. And that's exactly what they did. Now, the Pittman Act. Pittman Act was named after Senator Pittman from Nevada. What's Nevada? Nevada is the silver state. Pittman was the Harry Reid of his time, always looking out for his state. Well, Pittman realized that if they were to melt down this silver and sell it to England, if they pulled all those coins, those Morgan silver dollars, out of circulation, they'd have to mine more silver and sell it to the government and then mint more Morgan silver dollars. Well, that's exactly what the Pittman Act required for. So in 1921, the replacement began as the U.S. Mint began again minting Morgan silver dollars. The United States had not minted Morgan silver dollars since 1904, but there were plenty of them that were minted in the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s. That's how they were able to melt down 270 million Morgan silver dollars and ship them to England. So the U.S. started minting Morgan dollars in 1921. The same year, the U.S. also began minting those peace dollars. So in 1921, you had the Morgan silver dollar and the peace silver dollar, the recommencement of minting of silver dollars. And part of that was coming from the new silver pursuant to the Pittman Act that they had to replace based on what they had sold to England, the 270 million. I think it was about 250 million ounces because the silver dollars don't have a full ounce of silver in them. So under Senator Pittman, Key Denson Pittman, the senator from Nevada, he was the fierce advocate for the silver industry, and all that silver that was melted down and sold to England had to be replaced. It all mostly came from Nevada. And there was an additional catch. That silver came at a subsidized price of $1 an ounce, which was, I think, twice the going rate. So Pittman cut a real good deal for Nevada at the time. He also, in 1934, was the sponsor of, you guessed it, the Silver Purchase Act of 1934. So Pittman in 1918 agrees to have the government melt down 270 million Morgan silver dollars to put into bullion to send to England so England can ship them to India and alleviate a coin shortage, with the understanding that under the Pittman Act of 1918, that Nevada would produce more silver to replace the 270 million Morgan dollars, silver dollars, that had been destroyed or effectively melted down and sent to England. Now, they only made Morgan silver dollars in 1921. From then on, they minted peace dollars. By the way, the 1921 peace dollar is unique compared to the other peace dollars, and that is it is minted in a high relief. So it's somewhat of a unique coin. And they minted tens of millions of peace dollars up until 1935, when they stopped minting them altogether because they had replaced the 270 million under the statute that they were required to replace. There is a story that in 1964 they were planning on reintroducing the peace dollar just because the U.S. government wanted to flood the market with silver, and that year was the last year of silver content, so they wanted to get as much out there as possible. So they minted the most dimes, quarters, and half dollars they'd ever minted in a given year. They used 550 million ounces of silver that year in 1964, but they never got around to minting the 1964 peace dollar. Okay, so 1918, you've got Pittman Act, melt down those Morgans, silver Morgans, ship the silver to India, alleviate the shortage, and ship them to England to alleviate the Indian silver shortage, and then agree to mint more silver, mine more silver, and charge the government $1 per ounce for the purpose. Okay, so that all went into place in 1918, and that was well underway when Roosevelt signed the 1934 order confiscating silver, and when the Silver Purchase Act authorizing the purchase of another 1.3 billion ounces was passed by Congress, sponsored by Senator Pittman. All right. Well, why would, if the Pittman Act required the mining of additional silver to replace the Morgan dollars, why are they buying even more silver? Well, here's what happened. In 1921 to 1923, the government was using the newly mined silver to replace the silver dollars. But guess what happened? They didn't have other supplies of silver. So had they not melted the 270 million silver dollars, they wouldn't have to replace 270 million silver dollars in a short period of time. They would just issue the normal amount that they would, just to keep the amount that you needed. But because the Pittman Act required that they had to replace the 270 million, 95% of the silver at the U.S. Mint from 1921 to 1923 went into producing silver dollars, which meant there wasn't enough silver to mint sufficient quantities of dimes, quarters, and half dollars. For you numismatics, you will know that the early 1920 silver dimes, the 1921 silver dimes are rare because, and the silver quarters are rare because they didn't mint that many of them because they were using the silver to mint in copious amounts the Morgan and Peace dollars. They minted almost 90 million Morgan Peace and Peace dollars in 1921, but they only made 1 million Liberty Walking half dollars, very rare coin, only 2 million about Liberty Standing quarters, and only about 12 million Mercury dimes. Now, in 1922, they minted 67 million Peace dollars, but no quarters, no dimes, and no half dollars. The United States Mint did not mint any quarters, dimes, or half dollars of silver in 1922. Why? Because the available silver was going into replacing the Morgan silver dollars that they had melted down to the tune of 270 million. And now you can see in 1921 they minted 87 million to replace. In 1922 they minted 66 million to replace. 1923 they minted 56 million to replace the silver that had been melted down in the form of peace dollars now. But your quarters, your half dollars and dimes are not yet being minted in decent amounts because all that silver that's being mined now to replace the Pittman Act silver that was melted down is going into the replacement. So, even though they used 163 million ounces of silver at the U.S. Mint between 1921 and 1923, 95% of that silver went to mint the silver dollars, which meant, you can see it coming now, we're having a shortage of dimes, quarters, and half dollars. So during the period of time from 1921 to 1934, that's probably another reason why your barber, quarters, half dollars, and dimes, every time you see them, are really worn. Why? Because the ones that they minted in the 1890s, the early 1900s, 1910, before they introduced the Liberty Standing, the Mercury dime in 1916, the Liberty Walking half dollar in 1916, they didn't mint that many of them from 1916 to 1934. So they had to keep the older coins in circulation, and they got really worn down. That's why you'll also see older Mercury dimes really worn out. You could see that like in 1917, 18, 19, 20, 21, all those years are worn flat if you ever look through junk silver. But the later dates aren't as worn. And there's a reason, is because they didn't make as many of them back then because they didn't have the silver. So why was the silver confiscated? You guessed it, they needed the silver to mint the coins. They needed the silver to mint dimes, quarters, and half dollars. They already had allocated silver to buy to mint the dollars. So they needed that silver, and that's why there was an exemption for silver coins. Wouldn't have made any sense to turn in your dimes, quarters, and half dollars just so they can remint them. Although it might have, because you would turn that silver in, they can mint new coins, but they did not require the people to send it in. The reason they probably didn't, now that makes sense, wasn't just that it might make sense that you can turn those coins in and get new coins. If there already was a shortage of dimes, quarters, and half dollars, and they required you to turn them in, there'd be nothing to transact with other than silver dollars in the United States. Remember, gold's been pulled out in 1934, so you couldn't even use and the smallest denomination would have been the silver dollar, and there'd be no dimes, quarters, and half dollars if they confiscated all of those. So in 1934, 35, 36, 37, as I mentioned, the U.S. purchased about 1.36 billion ounces of silver and confiscated about 113 million ounces from its citizens. But then you look at the numbers from 1934 on. From 1934 on, they slowed down the production of the peace dollar, and they actually stopped making it in 1935. But they ramp up the production of the quarters and dimes. So if you go back to, if you can remember the numbers earlier, in the early 20s, they were only minting 1.9 million standing Liberty quarters in 1921, about $1 million half dollars, Liberty working half dollars, 12 million dimes. By 1935, after they had confiscated the silver, they went from 12 million dimes up to about 85 million dimes. They went from less than 2 million quarters up to 44 million quarters. And then the Liberty working half dollars went from 1 million to 16 million. So they acted immediately with that new silver, and they started to pour it into producing dimes and quarters and half dollars. And as I say, if you look at coins dated before then, the further back you go, the longer they had to stay in circulation, and that's why you see them worn. I used to think it was because, well, they're older, but a coin that's 10 years older than the other shouldn't be that much more worn out than a coin that was made in 1934. So you can look, and you can see a 1934 quarter, and it looks fine. It doesn't look worn out in general. And then if you look at some of the barber quarters or the standing Liberty quarters, they're all worn out. You have to find, I guess you have to buy them in special condition because they didn't make that many and they needed to stay in circulation a lot longer. Now, how did the government know who had the silver? Well, it basically said silver situated in the United States, but they did have a document called Hoarders of Silver. This is like the NSA at the time. The document showed individuals who held spot silver and futures contracts. So the spot silver and futures contracts showed by list who had the silver. And they were able to go after those people to get it. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt was pretty big on the executive order. He did Executive Order 6102, confiscate the gold for different reasons, and then he also confiscated silver with another executive order. And also, in 1942, Roosevelt wasn't done with executive orders. He issued Executive Orders 9066 and 9102, authorizing the removal and internment of Italian and Japanese Americans. Germans were under suspicion, but they were spared internment. Italians were sent to internment camps, as were Japanese Americans. So that's the story of silver confiscation in the United States. The Silver Purchase Act of 1937 expired on December 31st, 1937. And people will ask, did these executive orders set the precedent for future confiscation of gold and silver? And I say yes and no. Yes, in that both executive orders highlight that an unchallenged president basically can nationalize any commodity for any reason at any time. But no for the reasons that they confiscated the gold and silver in 1933 and 1934, because those reasons don't exist anymore. So, in 1933, gold and silver were recognized as money and were functioning as such. They were part of the national currency. People would have silver in their pockets, they could have gold in their pockets. The gold was taken to give the government control over the nation's wealth and then to remove from the citizens' day-to-day transactions. The silver was taken in order to actually give it back to the people in the form of coinage, because while they had demonetized the gold, confiscated it, silver was still considered money and considered currency, and they needed dimes, quarters, half dollars, and silver dollars. So they needed the silver for a different reason. The gold, they were taking it away from you. The silver, they were giving it back to you. The government's not going to do either of those today. They're not going to take your gold now for the nation's wealth, because the amount of gold that American citizens have is not worth that much. And the amount of silver that people have also isn't worth that much, but they clearly wouldn't take it so they can make it into coins and give it back to you. So neither of those reasons exist today. The government doesn't recognize either gold or silver as money. And the U.S. hasn't backed the dollar with gold since 1971 under the Bretton Woods agreements, as we've discussed, and has not minted silver coins since 1965. I say 1965 because they did mint 1964 dated 90% silver dimes, quarters, and half dollars well into 1965, because they wanted to make sure that no one would try to hoard these silver coins over the clad coins that were only copper and nickel, because they figured if they flooded the market with them. No one would want to hoard them. Johnson warned people not to hoard them. They also threatened to flood the market with silver so that the price of silver would never be worth hoarding the coins for. Basically, they were trying to say, look, a quarter is what we say it is, dime is what we say it is, and 50 cents is what we say it is based on what we stamp on it, not the metallic content. And by the way, we're going to mint more of these silver coins than we are the clad coins, so don't even try to hoard them. People hoarded them. Anyway, so I don't think we're going to confiscate your silver so that they can make coins, which leads into another issue, though. A lot of people think that we would return the silver. Now, the return the silver as money, meaning as a currency that could be used as an exchange, has an inherent conflict in the silver pumper story. Because they say silver is so rare, it's rarer than gold. Well, if that's the case, then there isn't enough silver to use and change. Now, when people use there isn't enough gold argument, they rightfully point out that we can always revalue gold. Clearly, you can revalue gold. So the argument that there isn't enough gold for a gold standard is nonsense because there just isn't enough gold at $1,300 an ounce. But clearly, you can raise the price. But if you want to transact in silver, there isn't enough silver. There just isn't. If it's supposedly that rare, if it's rarer than gold, it doesn't make any sense. So they're not going to ever go back to silver as a minting coins in silver. So they're not going to take people's silver in order to do that. And because the silver, silver annual mining production is worth about $18-20 billion. It's not worth that much at current prices. And the amount of silver that the United States Silver Eagle program, they've only issued a little over 500, maybe almost 600 million of them. So it's not even that much silver in the form of American Silver Eagles. If they wanted to confiscate silver, they would go to, you guessed it, J.P. Morgan's silver pile at the COMEX, which is about 140 million, I think, ounces. Again, it's not that much, but it's one place. The biggest place where you could find your largest silver stockpile would be at the ETFs. There's about 600 million ounces in those, supposedly, and supposedly in the SLV one I don't have the numbers in front of me, they have a few hundred million ounces. And supposedly, you don't know if what's on the COMEX, what JP Morgan says is in their COMEX vault exists either. But assuming that those piles exist, those are the two largest places where the U.S. could find silver. Now, they would not confiscate silver for money. We know that. There's no reason they're not going to confiscate it and try to mint it into dimes, quarters, and half dollars again. That's not going to happen. What they might need it for is some type of national emergency, some type of war effort. And in that case, then they would confiscate your silver. If they had a need, let's say it was a solar issue, or they needed it for solar panels, or they needed it to quell an outbreak because they wanted to put silver in all the water filters around the country, whatever it was, then they like any commodity, they can, under the current rules, even back then, just had to issue an executive order, they can take whatever they want. And I think that would be more likely, but I don't expect, there's nothing on the horizon, but of course that always could happen. And then the question is, how would they know you have it? Well, if you buy stuff online, like from a company that makes their own rounds, or you buy from a dealer, there's clearly a internet record of your purchases, so they can figure out that you have it. People say, well, I had a tragic boating accident, but that's not the point. The point is they can find out in general, if it was that necessarily, who had it and who didn't have it, and there's also the large stockpiles. But again, this is all very speculative, as if it only happened, the times it happened, it was not because of national emergencies. The easier thing also to do is nationalize mines, is not to go trying to find out who bought a silver shield coin. They could. I mean, they easily could find out, but that's not where they're going to get the bulk of their silver. What they could do is they would suspend the American Silver Eagle program. They could prohibit the making of silver rounds. They could say, look, silver's too valuable. You're making these medallions and stamping them with slogans. That's just a waste of silver. You can't do that. But the fact that they would confiscate is highly, highly unlikely. that they would do that. But that's your history lesson for today. Let me know what you think, and I guess we got some comments over here. I'm going to check them out. All right, Tom Manley, if you're still here, good evening. Gus the Broken made peace dollars and then they went to war. No, actually, they made the peace dollars in 1921, and that was after World War I. Yes, they finished making the peace dollars, and then they went to World War II. They made war dollars too. Yeah. Daniel Gummer, have you ever reviewed the book The Silver Stealers? No, and that's a good recommendation. I will check that out, Daniel. Gus the Broken, a crazy method to try to keep an economy running. Well, they needed to. A government's in charge of legal tender laws, and if they need money, they can't do, back then they couldn't do like they do now and print up. There were no small denominations they can even print. They could have issued, I've seen them during the Civil War. They did have like 25-cent notes, but I don't think that's what they wanted to do. Daniel Gummer, during the Great Depression, a few cities released their own copper tokens, local barter coins. That's true. And that happened during there was a lot of Civil War tokens as well. You see, what's happening with cryptos is very similar today. These are tokens. Everything's just moving to the digital world. And people can say that they're not worth anything. The value in cryptos is the same value in the tokens. It's not what the government says. It has value because it becomes a way that people can exchange value. And if people believe there's value there, the benefit to it is that you can use it to barter and to buy goods and services. Damn it. Gus the Broken, my feed is cracking up. Funny buggers are at it again. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde coins. I think that might have happened earlier. Database DNA. If the U.S. was selling silver to England,